Thank you for watching. Please drop a like and subscribe. But most importantly, do you think the Russian army is rubbish? Let me know in the comments. How can the Russian military be this bad? The Battle of Vuhledar has become synonymous with Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers exploding on open fields. Soldiers cowering next to these vehicles whilst under constant attack in the form of drone-dropped munitions, artillery, and machine gun fire. Then of course there were the rather horrific scenes of Russian vehicles riding over wounded soldiers in a chaotic and desperate attempt to escape, dragging their lifeless corpses across the field. There is literally photographic evidence of fields littered with dead Russians. So how does it keep going wrong for them? One of the main problems they have faced are the Ukrainian mines outside Vuhledar and their complete inability to deal with them. You see, the Ukrainians had adopted a super clever new method of laying mines. Ukrainian gunners would wait until Russian troops clear a path through an old minefield, then toss fresh mines onto that same path right as the Russians are crossing. For those of who don't know, Vuhledar is a town with a pre-war population of just 14,000 that lies a couple of miles north of Russian-held Pavlivka, 25 miles southwest of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region. The Russian Marine Corps' 155th and 40th Naval Infantry Brigades and the newly formed 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade launched a series of direct assaults on the Ukrainian 72nd Mechanized Brigade and 55th Artillery Brigade manning strong defensive position in and around the town. These attacks were clearly meant as the start of the much-anticipated Russian offensive, but the level of destruction meted out on the attackers was far more than they had expected. What was striking was the near-constant repetition of the same failed tactics. It went something like this: armored vehicles would roll in neat lines across the fields and forests between Russian-occupied Pavlivka and Vuhledar. The lead tank would hit a mine and explode. The rest of the column then immediately panicked. Some vehicles would try to go around the wrecked lead vehicle, only themselves to run into mines. Even retreat was dangerous, as the mines could have been laid behind the column as well. In just one bloody, chaotic day, the Russians lost 30 or more armored vehicles around Vuhledar. Their losses only got worse the following day. In Ukrainian mines were the destroyers in chief. Specifically, two types of mines: the Soviet TM-62 and the American Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAM. The 21-pound TM-62 is your traditional mine, a big metal disc, packed with explosives and fitted with a pressure fuse. Engineers bury TM-62s by hand or by deploying a GMZ mine-laying vehicle. The Remote Anti-Armor Mine System is a pack of 4-pound mines stacked 9 apiece in a hollow 155mm artillery shell. The ejection sequence triggers dependent on the set fuse, scattering the deadly cargo over the battlefield. These mines can be delivered at ranges from between 0.5 to 10.9 mile using either the M109, M198, or M777 series howitzers. By January 2023, the U.S. had sent approximately 10,200 rounds to Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and boy have they been used effectively. Just a reminder, use of anti-tank mines is not considered illegal in terms of the Ottawa Treaty. So, what changed for the Ukrainians? Because clearly nothing changed for the Russians. The Ukrainian army for a long time adhered to Soviet doctrine. And in Soviet doctrine, engineers lay defensive minefields right before an anticipated enemy attack. The minefields tend to be narrow but deep. They believe that shallow, strip-like minefields lack sufficient stopping power. There's a simple countermeasure to these types of minefields, which is to fit a heavy steel plow to the lead tank in a formation and line up the rest of the vehicles right behind that tank. But it's a delicate tactic. If the lead vehicles miss a mine or the trailing vehicles miss the lanes even a few feet left or right, the column can descend into a chaos of blasts and confusion. Even a clean pass by a mine plow doesn't guarantee safe passage for an armored column. The Ukrainians have been aiming RAM shells behind the mine plows, filling up the cleared corridor with them. The vehicles following the lead either were blown up by these mines, or when trying to leave the corridor. Now obviously with flexible tactics and better intelligence the Russians could negate the effectiveness of these mining operations. For example, if you know where the narrow TM62 minefields are, it shouldn't be hard to avoid them. But to keep up with Ukrainian engineers, a Russian commander would need 24-hour surveillance and reliable means of quickly disseminating fresh information to frontline forces. The problem is that the Russian generals and colonels are useless, and this is exacerbated by NCOs who are not empowered to make on-the-spot decisions. Being flexible does not enter the Russian lexicon. But in all fairness, good intel and flexible command might not save a Russian column from mines raining down from above. Probably the only way to stop RAM is to suppress the artillery sending the mines over, and that means effective counter-battery work. But unfortunately for the Russians, it's been a year of hell for them. Too many lost guns and far too many killed gunners have ruined the skills and equipment necessary for the task. So how bad has the Vuhledar debacle been? In terms of casualties, it is estimated that the Russians have lost at least 130 tanks and armored personnel carriers. The 155th Marine Infantry Brigade has all but been destroyed and has now been pulled off the line as combat ineffective, with some sources speaking of 500 casualties in 2 days of action. Please remember that the Marine Infantry Brigade is designated as an elite force, but it has already had been backfilled with mobilized replacements. This was confirmed by recent POWs. Given the large abundance of replacements, perhaps this unit is no longer elite, if it ever was. The 155th Brigade was meant to have been replaced by the 136th Guards Motorized Brigade, but they too issued a video statement decrying a lack of ammunition and overall support. Clearly the poor morale is starting to spread. No matter how you consider it, the battle at Vuhledar shows us that the Russians haven't changed. They are still making the same tactical mistakes and are coming back with the same results. They are losing the core of professional soldiers and will soon only be left with mobilized troops to fulfill the attacking role. Yet casualties just do not seem to bother them. It's astounding and points to an ingrained belief that soldiers are expendable and purely a means to an end. Historically, this lack of care goes back centuries. Of course, this failure by the army to mount a successful attack has only heaped further pressure on its hierarchy, especially with the success, albeit limited, of the Wagner Group in the Bakhmut area of operations. Wagner has used this failure as a way to shine their own star, but have, in so doing, incurred the wrath of the army and its logistics corps, with supplies to Wagner drying up in what can only be described as a tit-for-tat spat. You also cannot help wondering whether Wagner has been siphoning off the professional soldiers in the army with better pay offers, etc. Something that has also been noticed is the arrival of the Patriot PMC unit near Vuhledar. If you remember correctly, this is the PMC group that Defense Minister Shoigu has a direct interest in, so why it has popped up here is anyone's guess, but perhaps it will shortly become involved in direct action with the Ukrainians to save the army's blushes. Either way, the Russian army continues to bleed and to give daily examples of how inept it has become. The severe check they have received will embolden the Ukrainians for their own counterattack, which will undoubtedly have the southern arm focused on Mariupol. Defense Minister Shoigu recently gave the general in charge of the area, Rustam Muradov, the instruction that Vuhledar must be taken at all costs. Given the attempts thus far, this order will only spell doom for those thrown into the assault. With long-range HIMARS starting to work over the rear areas and the defensive lines only strengthening as time allows, it's going to suck to be a soldier in the Russian army.